Γεια σας. Είμαι η Μαρία Γεωργοπούλου, Διευθύντρια της Γεναδίου Βιβλιοθήκης και είναι μεγάλη μου χαρά να σας καλωσορίσω στο Κότσεν Χολ για την 42η ετήσια διάλεξη Walton, που ξεκίνησε ως θεσμός στη βιβλιοθήκη το 1982 για να τιμήσει τον εξαίρετο διευθυντή της Γεναδίου, τον Francis R. Walton, ο οποίος υπηρέτησε από το 1961 μέχρι το 1976. Και ένα από τα πολύ σημαντικά πράγματα που έκανε ο Frank Walton, ένα πρόσωπο μυθικό για μένα που δεν είχα την τύχη να τον γνωρίσω, είναι ότι κατάφερε και άνοιξε τη βιβλιοθήκη στο αθηναϊκό κοινό, αλλά επίσης την καταξίωσε και διεθνώς ως κέντρο μελέτης του ελληνισμού. Έτσι λίγο πολύ ο Walton και ο Γενάδιος νομίζω ότι ακολουθούσαν, μάλλον ο Walton ακολουθούσε τα παρόμοια χνάρια, πιστεύοντας ότι οι συλλογές της Γεναδίου μπορούν να γίνουν ένας σημαντικός πόλος έλξης για ερευνητές. Οπότε είναι πραγματικά μεγάλη μας χαρά που υπάρχει αυτή η διάλεξη Walton και προσπαθούμε να καλέσουμε ομιλητές, ερευνητές, επιστήμονες από όλο τον κόσμο για να μας δώσουν τα φώτα τους για κάποιο θέμα το οποίο είναι ενδιαφέρον, είναι πλατή και θα μας γεμίσει με καινούριες γνώσεις. Οπότε σήμερα είναι μεγάλη μου χαρά και τιμή να καλωσορίσω στο Κότσεν Χολ μια σημαντική βυζαντινολόγο από το Πανεπιστήμιο της Καλιφόρνιας στο Berkeley και από τη Θεσσαλονίκη, τη Μαρία Μαυρουδή, που θα μας ταξιδέψει στο Βυζάντιο και την κατανόησή του τα τελευταία 150 χρόνια. Θα συνεχίσω στα αγγλικά. Ladies and gentlemen, both here in Kotzen Hall and online, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the auditorium of the American School for the 42nd Annual Walton Lecture. This lecture was established in 1982 to honor a most visionary and beloved director of the Genadios Library, Francis R. Walton, who was director from 1961 to 1976. And he was very instrumental in leaving an indelible mark in the trajectory and history of the Gennadion. Because during his time and under his leadership, the Gennadios opened up to the Athenian community, to archives, to donations, but also to numerous scholars, both here in Greece and beyond. And his vision, along with that of Ioannis Genadios, paved the way for the development of a library beyond its strict boundaries here in Greece. So tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce a speaker who has been a leader in Byzantine studies and who is here to share with us a very interesting and broad topic that of Byzantium. And our speaker is Maria Mavroudi, professor of Byzantine history at the University of California, Berkeley, with additional appointments at the Department of Ancient Greek and Roman Studies, as well as Middle Eastern languages and cultures. Maria Mavroudi studied philology at the University of Thessaloniki, as I said, her native city, and earned a PhD in Byzantine studies at Harvard. A philologist who speaks with conviction about the global reach of Byzantium then and now, a historian of science and the occult, Maria Mavroudi is eager to break down stereotypes, to pave new paths of knowledge, and to convince you that language and philology matters. She manages to capture your attention, discussing seemingly minute details, because she's always ready to respond to an argument with something concrete and fascinating. I vividly remember a phone call in the early 2000s from the MacArthur Prize Committee asking me to appraise Maria Mavroudi's scholarship. What an emotional, triumphant moment was that for me. The feisty compatriot who valiantly conversed with giants in the field in Greek and Arabic, and English, of course, Tomaraki, the little Maria, the young little Maria, as I used to call her, was going to be awarded the Genius Award. In her scholarship, as a PhD student at Harvard and as a young assistant professor at Princeton and UC Berkeley, Maria managed and had managed already to trace previously unrecognized intellectual exchanges between two cultures, Byzantium and Islam, that until then, and I'm simplifying maybe, but until then had sort of remained and thought to be totally antagonistic. Her scholarly work began by focusing on a 10th century Byzantine book on dream interpretation, a book that was thought to be a Christian dream book that looked back to ancient times. And this is what was being recognized at the time. And instead, she actually showed that this manual of Artemidoros was a Christian adaptation of Arabic Islamic material, and it was not the only one. So she started studying this group of texts that had been translated from Arabic and Persian into Greek between the 9th and 15th centuries. During the next 2 decades, she worked on identifying where these translations had happened within Byzantine literary culture and the reception in East and West during the medieval and early modern period. As I said, Maria is never happy with facile and easy solutions. She digs deeply, and this meant that she had to reevaluate the position of ancient Greek classics within the Byzantine, the Arabic, and the Latin intellectual traditions. And of course, within all this was to question the marginality of Byzantium within a broader medieval intellectual universe. So, Maria Mavroudi is a true Renaissance woman. She has produced several books and numerous articles on Byzantine science, poetry, philosophy, and more, always going where the sources take her, more often than not, going against the grain. She's currently working on a book entitled Bilingualism in Greek and Arabic, Evidence from the Manuscripts, and I think we all look forward to this. But in the meantime, you have to choose, you can choose in between 3 books and more than 40 or 50 articles. So as a MacArthur Fellow and as a valiant member of the Board of Overseers of the Gennadios Library, Maria Mavroudi knows what a public intellectual ought to do. So for her talk today, she chose a broad, important topic that we're all eager to hear. She will be thinking about Byzantium as Roman, Greek, and Christian. Maria.
Thank you so much. Before I begin with my talk, I just want to say my own connection with Walton. It's through meeting his son David a sunny afternoon in California and talking with him, and mostly about his memories of being a child in Greece. And it was through his memories that I knew that the dad must have loved Greece tenderly, because otherwise the children don't come out this way. So I'm very honored to be giving this lecture in his memory. So adequately discussing them would be a multi-volume project. It would require examining how these qualities were experienced by the Byzantines themselves over a millennium, and how other medieval civilizations and modernity perceived these qualities in Byzantine culture. A humble alternative is attempted today. Tonight's focus will be on a single text, the introduction to Karl Krumbacher's History of Byzantine Literature, which was published in 1891. And I chose it because it's a representative of Byzantine studies when it became a modern academic discipline toward the end of the 19th century. This introduction discusses major and recurring topics in the modern historiography of Byzantium: its periodization, Roman self-identification, Christian identity, and relationship with the ancient Greek past. Tonight, we will also examine how Byzantinists in the 21st century approached the same topics and outline what their conclusions imply for the present and future of Byzantine studies. Karl Krumbacher's History of Byzantine Literature is a landmark of modern scholarship on Byzantium. It helped Krumbacher become the first incumbent of the newly created chair of Byzantine Studies at the University of Munich, the first of its kind at any modern university. Further, it was read continuously from 1891 into the 1970s, when it was eclipsed by equivalent reference volumes authored by Herbert Hunger and Hans-Georg Beck. These volumes updated Krumbacher's facts, but they did not change his presentation of Byzantine literary production as a collection of distinct literary genres, and did not recalibrate how Byzantine literature fits into a continuum of Greek literature. Hunger and Beck thus carried the echo of Krumbacher's work into the 21st century. During the last 2 decades, researchers pointed out that literary genres in Byzantium functioned in ways radically different than in modernity, and repeatedly emphasized the dialogue of Byzantine literature with literary cultures in languages other than Greek. These recent scholarly trends have implications about Byzantium's periodization, Romanness, Christianity, and relationship with ancient Greek past that cannot be addressed here. Today, we will briefly discuss the implications of Krumbacher's assessments beyond literary history. His introduction opens with explaining why the beginning of the Byzantine period should be placed during the reign of Constantine I, the first Christian Roman emperor in the 4th century. This revises earlier propositions to consider as the beginning of the Byzantine era the reign of Justinian in the 6th century, or the coronation of Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor in the year 800. Debates on how to divide the Byzantine millennium into shorter periods of time with distinct characteristics each are much earlier than the 19th century and continue to occupy Byzantinists into the 21st. Overall, it bears emphasizing that although history of any kind is a continuum, dividing up longer stretches of time into discrete shorter ones allows for greater resolution when studying certain historical phenomena. It is therefore a necessary but subjective exercise because it largely depends on the criteria one adopts in order to emphasize rifts rather than continuities in the historical process. The more recent debates on the periodization of Byzantine history are partly driven by the growth of late antiquity into an autonomous academic discipline since the 1970s. In 2022, Yannis Touraitis pointed out that this discussion reveals the term Byzantine Empire as a problematic category of periodization because one of its important functions as a modern signifier was to construct the signified primarily in terms of exclusion and otherness, of something that has very little to do with its own past. Indeed, as Byzantinists well know, the label Byzantine is a neologism of 16th century Western European scholars. Part of the reason for inventing and perpetuating it within a Western academic intellectual universe was to promote Charlemagne's empire as the exclusive heir to Roman legacy. At the same time, it bears emphasizing that debates on periodization are certainly not particular to the Byzantine field. Rather, as part and parcel of interpreting and writing about history of any kind, they exist in every field because different generations of historians and school of thought apply different criteria to divide up and manage long stretches of time. The enterprise of writing national histories from the 19th century onward created additional problems of periodization in Byzantine and other kinds of history because it was meant to promote the demographically homogeneous and territorially bounded nation-state as the natural, political, and social unit. An example of variable periodization for a geography that was for a while part of the Byzantine Empire is Egypt. Deciding when ancient Egypt ends depends on how one defines antiquity, implicitly a constituent part of Western modernity, as well as Egypt, whether it is primarily a geographic or state entity, and whether the past states to which the geography of Egypt belonged are related or not with the modern state of Egypt. Accordingly, one can argue that ancient Egypt ends with Nectanebo II, who reigned for between 360 to 343 BCE, and is reckoned as its last native ruler until President Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was in office in 1956 to 1970. This is not a joke. This is exactly how Nasser styled himself as the first native son of Egypt to rule over an independent Egypt, and it has to do with the end of colonialism. Alternatively, one can choose as a terminus the Roman victory over Cleopatra as the last ruler of an independent Egypt, 51 to 39 BCE. Constantine the Great as the first Christian emperor, if we deem Christianity as the harbinger of the Middle Ages. The Arab conquest of Egypt from 639 to 42 CE, if we follow the Western medievalist Henri Pirenne in assigning this role to Islam. Or some later point, if the early Islamic period counts as an integral part of late antiquity, which implies that an Islamic country can be a participant to Western modernity. And this idea of Islam as part of late antiquity has been promoted since the 1970s in various, both within Middle Eastern studies and also from the point of view of Greco-Roman antiquity. So pinpointing when the Egyptian Middle Ages end and when Egyptian modernity begins is equally debatable. Is it the Ottoman conquest of Egypt in 1517, and therefore its incorporation into an early modern state? Or is it the reign of the westernizing reformer Muhammad Ali, 1805 to 48? Thessalonians and Northern Greeks well know that he's from Kavala, and he's an Albanian, but he is the founder of modern Egypt because he was, as I said, a westernizing reformer who also asserted Egypt's independence from the Ottoman Empire, and therefore introduced features that made it into the state that it is today. Further east, when and what exactly the Chinese Middle Ages cover is a vexed problem in modern historiography. Many decisions depend on a researcher's readiness to draw parallels between Chinese and Western European historical developments, and therefore impose or adapt to Chinese phenomena a periodization invented for Western Europe. Seen from this perspective, as a subaltern and orientalized historiographical example shaped by the hegemonic Western European one, the Chinese and the Byzantine case bear a striking resemblance. It is important for Byzantinists to remember such parallels in order not to paint our field to a corner of imagined exceptionalism that will deprive it of its potential to speak beyond its own confines. In keeping with the hegemonic role assigned to Greco-Roman antiquity as a cornerstone of Western modernity, Krumbacher's introduction extensively discusses the Roman quality of the Byzantine state and the relationship between Byzantine culture and the ancient Greek heritage. From a late 19th century German and Central European perspective, addressing the claims of medieval heirs to the ancient Roman imperial tradition helped parse contemporary political anxieties. These were generated by the formal dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806, the hopes for its reconstitution in the decades that followed, and the calls for Germany's unification by nationalists. Krumbacher was a nationalist. I'm not going to analyze this tonight, but if one reads through his works, one understands why. The calls for Germany's unification by nationalists, for whom the most important point of reference was the Empire of Charlemagne, rather than the one dissolved in 1806. German unification was effected in 1871 with the creation of the German Empire as a nation-state. It is therefore not surprising that Krumbacher's thoughts on Byzantium's Roman identity were more widely shared by late 19th century Byzantine historians. Outside of Germany, a prominent example is J.B. Bury's A History of the Late Roman Empire from Arcadius to Irene, 395 to 800, which was published in 1889. In the introduction, Bury insists that, I quote, "the line of Roman emperors continued in unbroken succession from Octavius Augustus to Constantine Palaiologos." End of quote. Accordingly, calling the empire that ruled from Constantinople Byzantine or Greek is a misnomer that obscures its Roman character. Bury, 1861 to 1927, was an Irishman, but not a Catholic. This was an Irish Protestant. His father was rector of the Anglican Church of Ireland. Intellectuals of his time routinely used the Roman imperial past as a paradigm that elucidated the British imperial present. In such a context, it is understandable that an Anglo-Irish like Bury would wish to emphasize the Roman, that is, the imperial and cosmopolitan aspect of Byzantium, instead of its ethnic composition, which the labels Greek and Byzantine did. Bury's argument for the continuity of the Roman Empire in Byzantium is a response to historians who emphasized Byzantium's Greekness over its Roman imperial culture. A foremost example is George Finlay, 1791 to 1875, so 2 generations older than Bury. He was therefore inspired by a very different political context in which Greek nationhood was a primary problem of European politics. As a young man, Finlay became an early and enthusiastic supporter of Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire. In 1823, he abandoned his legal studies and followed Lord Byron to Greece. After Greek independence was won, Finlay bought a landed estate in Athens and lived there until his death. He expounded his views on Byzantine history as national Greek history in his widely influential A History of Greece from the Roman Conquest to the Present Time, 146 BC to 1864. He's not crazy. The Greek independence at the time was a major event in European and world history because it is the first nation state that is created independent, carved out of a multinational empire, the Ottoman Empire. So it's the beginning of the end. The cracks are seen in this edifice of empires. It's an extremely important event. So Finlay is at the forefront of politics at the time. Debating whether Romanness or Greekness was Byzantium's most defining characteristic is not new in the 19th century, which is known as the age of nationalisms. Both views are already recorded in 15th century texts and were especially influential in Italy, the European geography that most closely interacted with late Byzantine intellectual life. Krumbacher's arguments on Byzantium's Roman quality explicitly include a modern Greek perspective, understandable for somebody writing in Munich, given that between 1832 and 1862, Greece was ruled by a Bavarian king and a largely Bavarian cabinet. Krumbacher emphasized that throughout the Byzantine period and into his own day, the most important way that speakers of Greek identified themselves was as Roman, in preference to Greki or Hellenes. He also explained that the linguistic Hellenization of the Eastern Roman Empire did not obstruct its Roman self-awareness. By implication, this renders the Byzantine Empire a Greek nation-state with Roman consciousness. In this, though not in everything, he agreed with Konstantin Paparigopoulos, the founding father of Greek nationalist historiography, whose History of the Modern Greek Nation, published between 1860 and 1874, outlined Greek history as a continuum stretching from antiquity to the present. Krumbacher was unusually knowledgeable about contemporary Greek language and culture, including its intellectual trends. His awareness began with a youthful journey to Greece in 1884 to 85 and continued through long-term contact with Greek friends from his youth, who had, after studying in Munich, returned to their native country and became luminaries of its intellectual life. He was therefore well informed of 19th century Greek debates that sought to define the historical underpinnings of a modern Greek identity. Neither Krumbacher nor Paparigopoulos were oblivious to Byzantium's multi-ethnic demography. Still, they offered the building blocks that helped construe Byzantium as a Greek nation-state with a Roman consciousness. This portrayal became part of the Greek secondary school narrative on national history into the late 20th century. It was abandoned by professional Byzantinists considerably earlier in favor of Byzantium as a multi-ethnic empire. In the 21st century, it was revived by Anthony Kaldelis, who, in addition, labeled the Byzantine state a republic. This second idea can also be found in Krumbacher's introduction. In the course of refuting presumed Byzantine features that were incompatible with Western modernity, Krumbacher asserted that, I quote, Byzantium is less despotic than its reputation asserts, and that it bears a closer resemblance to France after 1789 than before. The statement must be understood as part of the broader intellectual atmosphere of the time, dominated by Theodor Mommsen, the greatest Roman historian of 19th century Germany and a prominent politician. Many of his works on the Roman period were effectively reflections on governance applicable to 19th century German and European politics, which produced various forms of representative government. Mommsen and Krumbacher were writing under one such model, a constitutional monarchy, the newly created German Empire, during a period of intensive reorganization of European monarchies along constitutional lines. The republican features of the late antique Roman Empire were also discussed by Bury in 1910. Like Krumbacher, Bury was writing under a constitutional monarchy at a time of growing demands for social inclusivity and liberal reforms in British governance. The German Empire was abolished in 1918, when the form of governance changed from monarchy to republic. Still, new circumstances led to further explorations of Rome's imperial legacy. During Adolf Hitler's chancellorship, 1933 to 45, the German state was styled as the Third Reich, counting the Holy Roman Empire of 800 to 1816 as the first, and the German Empire of 1871 to 1918 as the second. Accordingly, in the 1930s, distinguished German scholars re-examined the medieval Roman empires, both Eastern and Western, searching not for their republicanism, but for their presumed or real ideal of a single universal Roman Empire. A discussion with obvious implications for Hitler's global ambitions, in which the German Byzantinist Franz Dölger, a supporter of the Nazi Party, played a leading role. After the Second World War, German scholars returned to the exploration of medieval republicanism. Hans-Georg Beck, a later occupant of Krumbacher's chair at the University of Munich, did so in the 1960s and 1970s. For Beck, Byzantium resembled a constitutional monarchy because the emperor was understood not as an autocrat, but as an administrator of the state and its people. During the last couple of decades, explorations of medieval republicanism were prompted by the fragility no longer of monarchies, but of democracies. An explicit goal of Jacques Dallarune's Gouverner, c'est servir, essai de démocratie médiévale, is to govern is to serve, an essay in medieval democracies, is to remind its readers of the reciprocal bonds of service and humility that underpin increasingly fragile democracies in the 21st century. Byzantinists continue to debate both the exact form of Byzantine governance and the Greek versus Roman aspects of Byzantine culture. A response to Kaldelis's aforementioned conclusions on Byzantine collective identity came from Stouraitis, who asserted that Byzantium's Romanness was an elite identity meaningful to those connected with Constantinople, but not to other groups. In its own way, Stouraitis' emphasis on Romanness as an elite ideology complements Kaldelis's description of Hellenism as an elite identity until the Komnenian period. 1081 to 1180, when it shifted to being a national one. The same chronology of a shift in national self-awareness can be found in Krumbacher, who pointed out that only the emperors of the late Byzantine period, from the Komnenian dynasty onward, identified themselves as Greek. Dating the emergence of Greek self-awareness to the 12th century conforms, like other elements of Krumbacher's analysis, to 19th century ideas applied to the Western Middle Ages, and especially the appearance of literary texts written in various European vernaculars and therefore considered as marking the beginnings of European national literatures. However, as more recent scholarship has discussed, squeezing Byzantium or other Orientalized entities like the Chinese and the Arabic-speaking worlds into a mold created for the Western European paradigm is problematic and unsustainable, because it anachronistically projects onto the pre-modern past various modern ideas regarding the role of language, religion, and ethnicity in shaping individual and collective identity. In addition, the idea of national or other group identities as constructed by elites, and therefore not primordial, which is central to the discussion between Kaldelis and Stouraitis, reflects a paradigm shift that was introduced in the 1980s and continues to influence academic writing. I think that the classic, because it's shorter than any other, is Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, that I think every graduate student in the US, I don't know beyond, has read. So it's the idea that everything is constructed, the self-awareness is constructed by modernity. At the same time, from the 2000s onward, scholarship on national and other group identities acknowledges a debt to the pioneering ideas of sociologist Rogers Brubaker, who described group identity not as stable, but dynamic, and constantly reconfigured in relationship to another. For Brubaker, group identity is a perspective on the world instead of a thing in the world. I will parse this using my own family as an example. I have two children born in the United States of two Greek parents. They both speak perfect Greek and perfect English. You don't recognize in which language they were brought up. Depending on who asks them, like sometimes people ask them, are you Greek, are you American? The answer is never the same. I think even if I ask them, they have, like, it's a different moment in time that determines, I think they feel both. So that's exactly what Brubaker is putting his finger on. So Brubaker's ideas are mentioned in scholarly literature on the Byzantine past, but have not yet led to any clear departure from earlier conceptualizations of Byzantine collective identity. We pay lip service to the new idea, we don't know how to use it. Be that as it may, the emphasis of contemporary sociology on personal and collective identity as a dynamic and not static experience underscores the need to carefully contextualize the primary sources from which we try to extract information on Byzantine collective identities: Roman, Christian, Greek. In other words, if being a Roman, a Christian, or a Greek is a perspective on the world, it means that one can be all three things at once, like my children, but mobilize each component at different times and talk about it in different ways. Or be entirely silent or on one or more such component, depending on what is demanded by variable circumstances. Accordingly, the historian can never take at face value any statements made in the primary sources regarding Byzantine collective and personal identity. Instead, the historian must first try to understand the circumstances in which a particular aspect of Byzantium's Roman, Greek, and Christian identity is articulated, and then assess why the articulation takes the form it does. So an example from the sources, I think it's in Theophanes. He talks about, sometime in the late 8th century, there is a frontier town, and the Arabs are coming. It's a Byzantine town. The Arabs are coming, and the general of the place has instructions and gives instructions not to defend anything. But there is a local man who puts up resistance, and then successful resistance, the Arabs are pushed back, and then is punished by the general, the Byzantine general. The response is that he and the entire village convert to Islam. So there is a context here. It's not that it's not important to be Greek, Byzantine, Christian, whatever we want to call it, but it is the local response at the local level that informs the later decision. It doesn't mean that the earlier identity is weak, but it is an identity informed by this local community. I hope I make sense. Instead, as I said, the historian must first try to understand the circumstances in which a particular aspect of Byzantium's identity is articulated, and then assess why it's so. A careful historical and philological contextualization of the primary sources is therefore paramount. In addition, in other words, we can't import methodologies because they're invented in 21st century academia without thinking about what the sources actually do for us carefully. So, in addition to Romanes, Krumbacher considered the constant references by Byzantine writers to ancient Greek literature as a constituent part of Byzantine nationhood. He objected to earlier and more recent classicists who used Byzantine literary culture as a vast warehouse from which to retrieve Greek antiquity intact, and considered Byzantium as the mummifier of ancient Greek literary heritage. Instead, Krumbacher insisted that the relationship of the Byzantines with Greek antiquity was a living and evolving one, and that it was part of their sense of nationhood. This, according to Krumbacher, was very different from the status of Latin literature in medieval Europe, which was not considered part of national literature anywhere, not even by the Italians prior to humanism. Today, it may seem surprising that Krumbacher asserted a dynamic instead of static relationship of the Byzantines with ancient Greek literary culture. The reason is that the image of the Byzantines as passive preservers and poor imitators of antiquity was definitively abandoned only during the last generation of scholarship. The catalyst for such a belated change came not from within the fields of classical or Byzantine studies, but from broader political, societal, and academic changes that have been increasingly felt since the 1980s. These changes toppled the study of the ancient world from the pedestal it used to occupy when it was considered a cornerstone of Western modernity, which, in its turn, was deemed as a positive value that contributed to human progress. Today, the post-colonial and political and social order, an increasing environmental crisis, a growing fear for the consequences of unbridled modern technologies and other phenomena considerably beyond the scope of the ancient world's academic study has generated skepticism and negative critique for the West, however that's construed, modernity, and everything formerly considered as their constituent elements. Unsurprisingly, in the 21st century, Greco-Roman antiquity is frequently vilified. An unintended upside of this regrettable development is that it frees Byzantinists to do what Krumbacher had called for so long ago. Krumbacher's introduction implicitly addresses an additional constituent element of Western modernity, secularism. Krumbacher points out that the relationship between ancient and Byzantine Greek literary culture cannot be divorced from the opposition between Christianity and paganism. For this reason, it cannot be properly assessed without reference to Religionsgeschichte, the critical and historical study of religion that, as a discipline on the rise toward the end of the 19th century, gave voice to that period's political demands for secularization. Here, Krumbacher alludes to important debates of his time, whether the Hellenization of the Christian faith was a corrupting influence on Christianity, the position of the influential Protestant scholar Adolf von Harnack, or a successful synthesis of the two, the Catholic and Orthodox response to Harnack. The opposition between Christianity and paganism references a further 19th century debate, the relationship between faith and reason, in which paganism is associated with reason and serves as a metaphor for secularization. In this context, Krumbacher references and rejects the idea that paganism survived throughout the Byzantine period among secret devotees who publicly professed Christianity. In the 19th century, this idea was advanced by Konstantinos Sathas. It was recently relaunched into circulation by Kaldelis, under the explicitly acknowledged influence of the famous political philosopher Leo Strauss, 1899 to 1973. Strauss extensively developed and applied to medieval thinkers like Maimonides and Al-Farabi an idea originally encountered in Plato. A philosopher's teachings convey both an esoteric meaning, understood by his disciples, and an exoteric meaning meant for the hoi polloi. Philosophers and their followers could dissimulate conformity with societal norms and expectations in order to avoid persecution, while remaining faithful to true philosophy. Kaldelis analyzed the writings of prominent Byzantine intellectuals like Procopius of Caesarea and Michael Psellos under a Straussian lens, and concluded that they are crypto-pagans of sorts, so back to Sathas. Enough has been said to show that 19th century debates on the Roman, Greek, and Christian identity of Byzantium and its presumed or real differences with the Western European paradigm were effectively ways to discuss collective identities and political desiderata deemed important for European politics at the time. These politics were dominated by the process of creating modern secular nation-states through dividing multi-ethnic and multi-confessional empires or uniting smaller feudal entities into national wholes. The repetition of the same debates within the Byzantine field in the 21st century recycles many of the same arguments within different historical circumstances. An important change compared with the 19th century is the rejection of the nation-state as a formation that guarantees the well-being of its citizens as a homogeneous demography, in favor of pursuing ideals of social justice for previously underrepresented groups within an increasingly diverse demography. Another change, increasingly palpable since the end of the Cold War in 1991, is the renewal of nationalist sentiments throughout Euro-America in response to these profound demographic changes, both ethnic and religious, caused by mass immigration, both voluntary and involuntary, across national borders. A third change, also increasingly palpable since the 1990s, is the rise or increased aggravation of various religious fundamentalisms internationally. This is coupled with an increased ignorance of basic facts about Christianity as a cultural and historical phenomenon in the industrialized world, which is a symptom of its successful secularization. These new conditions that have profoundly reshaped the demography of the industrialized world beg redefining, or at least restating, what the basis of collective identity is within each state, and prompt historians to probe such definitions in the periods and geographies that they each study. To some, they also suggest a need to find a better place for faith in the industrialized world's public life, if for no other reason, at least in order to prevent extreme ideologies from occupying the social, cultural, and moral vacuum created by its absence. To others, they suggest a need for further secularization. Both tendencies are reflected in scholarship on the ancient and medieval world, especially regarding the place that individual historians cede or not to religion as a constituent of personal and collective identities. The 21st century interest in the Roman Empire and its medieval successors is prompted by the post-imperial but also post-national circumstances of the 21st century. The renewed interest in analyzing and comparing pre-modern and modern empires addresses a desire to understand how big and complex organizations rise and fall or transform. The label fall versus transformation depends on whether one prefers a pessimistic or optimistic interpretative line, with implications about the future of present equivalents to the older empires. So the transformation paradigm was introduced in late medieval studies at the time of the disintegration of the British Empire as a colonial entity by British historians, foremost among whom is the much admired Peter Brown. It's the optimistic way to parse what was happening in the 1970s. Contemporary state entities with imperial aspirations, that is, an ambition to dominate globally, that could be compared with Imperial Rome or Constantinople as the second Rome, include the Russian Federation, an heir to the Soviet imperialism of the Cold War period and home to Moscow as the third Rome, and the People's Republic of China. These states are increasingly occupying the vacuum left by powerful states with global ambitions that have cut back on the level of their international intervention, such as the United States and former colonial empires like the United Kingdom and France. The economic, social, and demographic forces that threaten the European Union with disintegration provide further reasons to explore what caused the dismemberment of earlier empires. I come to my conclusions. What does the present situation that I just described mean for Byzantine studies? As Paul Magdaleno pointed out in a 2016 essay on the political ideology of the Byzantine Empire, it depends on what we expect of our works of historical scholarship. Are they to be pieces of academic journalism, to be discarded when read and replaced as soon as possible? Or should they aspire to be classics of their genre, works of literature that endure as works of reference? I haste to mention that Mommsen received the first Nobel Prize for Literature for his Roman history. I don't think anybody, historian of any period, can aspire to the same. So that shows the change. Few academic historians, so Magdaleno continues, few academic historians can afford to opt entirely for one or the other. Like the authors of both their primary and their secondary sources, they are constantly pulled in both directions. That's the end of Magdaleno's quote. This statement acknowledges how challenging it can be to translate specialized historical knowledge for a wide educated readership. An important service to any academic discipline, since societies are unwilling to finance or otherwise sustain knowledge for which they see no use. The challenge grows as the coverage of history diminishes in the middle and high school curricula of the industrialized world. Further, Compared with the 19th century, when modern research universities were created and Byzantine studies found a place within them, the social position of academics has changed. In the 19th century, academia was deemed a public good and was expected to provide the ideas and the people who would lead modern nation-states. Whence the remarkable prominence of Mommsen as an ancient historian and parliamentarian. By the 21st century, we witness an increased corporatization of higher education in the US and Europe. Its symptoms include the pursuit of profit-making and the increasing neglect of humanistic inquiry in the name of cost-cutting. I think everybody who's an academic in this room has their own tales of sorrow. This means that academia is no longer expected to lead society, but to ideologically and practically support the direction that society is already taking. A concrete example on how the trend applies to Greece. The creation of a national academy was discussed in connection to Greek nation building from 1824 until its creation in 1926. The reason to create and pay for royal and national academies is to use them as advisory boards to the politicians who serve on governments. According to the current president of the Academy of Athens, Michalis Tiverios, an archaeologist of the Roman period, the last time that the Greek government consulted the National Academy, after a long hiatus of non-consultation, was 18 years ago in 2007. The problem had to do with the teaching of history in 6th grade, and specifically with the representation of Greek history in the textbook adopted for the national curriculum. I will now address my Greek audience with just one phrase. Οι Έλληνες συνοστίζονται στο λιμάνι της Μύρινης. Δεν νομίζω ότι όποιος ζούσε στην Ελλάδα τότε μπορεί να το ξεχάσει. In the 21st century, historians are no longer powerful politicians and sometimes confess that they see themselves as writing to entertain rather than guide the largest possible audience they can attract. This makes sense in a world where entertainers are increasingly likely to become powerful politicians. Examples from earlier decades include US President Ronald Reagan, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi. Presently, it is well understood that Donald Trump's public profile was raised by hosting the TV show The Apprentice for 11 years. The show's popularity helped propel him to the US presidency. The dominance of social media and the establishment of statistically measurable criteria for success has only augmented the pre-existing anxiety of many professional categories, including academics, to be perceived as influential. I just described a rift in the relationship between academia and society that contributes to the perpetuation of political impasses and, in the end, undermines democracy. Since I believe that as an academic, my obligation is to propose ways out of impasses instead of just describing them, here is my proposition on how to address the dire situation. If historians are to support democratic dialogue in the societies where they live, assuming we value democratic dialogue, and regain their social importance, or simply maintain what's left of it, they can achieve it only through interrogating and carefully contextualizing the primary sources in order to go beyond the obvious. In other words, historians can be valuable to their societies not if they confirm existing societal trends, but if they manage to discern and articulate something that pertains to contemporary dilemmas, but is not readily available in contemporary society's way of thinking. In other words, by avoiding at any price pandering. True, offering one's readers what is already familiar and therefore easily digestible helps broaden the reception of one's writings. It's a fact. but doing so condemns scholarship to constantly offer old wine in new bottles, and confirms society's expectation that academia is there not to lead, but to follow its dictates. To my mind, in spite of the neglect or non-existence of history in today's political landscape, the existential need of humans to know about their past is confirmed by the presence of all of you tonight. And for this, I am profoundly grateful. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Maria, for really opening this inquiry into something much broader and into looking into ourselves, I guess, and our role and all of that. And, you know, Byzantium has to lead the way? Is this what you're saying?
I'm saying that Byzantium can lead the way, if we want it. It's in our hands. It's in mine. I'm trying. Tonight I'm trying.
Questions?
Please, yeah.
I would like to make a comment, since you were talking about the situation in academia, about the American Historical Association, that I'm afraid that they are losing their credibility, because I think 1 year after the genocide in Gaza has started, the only thing that they could say was to say only about scholasticide, right? Not genocide. And not only that, they retracted this statement. They were forced to say, to even annul this modest and timid statement. So I think that that situation started before Trump, right? Even from, there's a tremendous responsibility on the part of Biden, right? So my question is that we cannot have an autonomous, credible, and how can I say, inquisitive and inspiring intellectual elite in the US and abroad, if there is no moral commitment to some values, and this value is that every single life is sacred, whether it is Israeli or Palestinian. And I'm afraid that the Palestinians is a taboo subject, and we are seeing now the result today, that there are 14,000 children are expected to die at this moment that we're talking, right?
My own comment to your comment is that the problem is broader than what's happening in Gaza, and it can all be summarized in the verse by Andreas Calvos, «Θέλει αρετή και τόλμη ελευθερία». Freedom requires virtue and daring. So unless we dare, if we are cowards, we deserve our position as the tail end of societal developments. If we are to lead again as a group, we have to be bold and pay the price. Nothing's for free.
Other questions?
I'm afraid this is a completely unconnected subject, but I was interested in the question of the schism between the Orthodox and the Catholic in respect of the question of Byzantium as Roman Greek and so forth.
This is a very large question that I will try to answer using some of the material that I went through tonight, although it can be answered in different ways as well. This has been treated in different ways in modern scholarship, very much influenced by modern ecclesiastical policies, and especially the effort at rapprochement between the Orthodox and the Catholic Church during Vatican II. So some people see this as an unbridgeable rift, and others as something that was no big deal, so much so that Alexius I, when the Crusaders came, said, I remember we were disagreeing with these people, but remind me what was this all about. So it can be analyzed in different ways.
Thank you.
I wonder if you can expand a little bit on the Paparigopoulos and Krumbacher sort of idea of continuity and ethnic identity.
Okay. So there's a lot going on in how Krumbacher writes. As I said, it is his own German nationalism, and it is his dialogue with people in Greece that he knew from Munich. And so they are witnessing, during their own lifetimes, there are so many empires that are around, and they can see they are multi-ethnic and multinational. And it's not only the Ottoman Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, etc., etc. So they project, I think, the national struggles that are happening. I mean, the 19th century is the century of the creation of modern nation-states, and these are happening as, Hungary, Austria, Hungary as a separate kingdom, etc., blessed by Empress Sisi of Austria, supporting Hungarian nationalism, all of that. These are what they're, it's happening exactly as they write these things. So to make a long story short, I think by acknowledging the multinationalism, they're acknowledging what they and everybody else around them knows, but at the same time they privilege the national struggle, the nationalist struggles, because this is the progressive politics of that time. Does this make any sense?
It seems to me, there is a question. Okay.
Could you say a few words about how the question of Byzantium's Romanness and Greekness was perceived by Byzantine historians in countries such as Russia or Bulgaria?
It depends at which time we are looking at this. The relationship of former Eastern Europe with Byzantium is very different than the one of Western Europe with Byzantium, because there is the consciousness that Christianity came from Byzantium. It's the same kind of Christianity as their own. And there is a rift between how this is viewed before the Soviet, like before 1917, let's say, in Russia, and after, and also before the Second World War and after in Bulgaria. So, and depending on how one construes also the relationship with Eastern Orthodoxy within these countries, whether it is something that is to be cherished or something obstructive to modernity, which is a very big and complex issue within Russian historical writing and within modern Russian intellectual history, then you get different understandings of Byzantium. I'll give some examples. One of the art historians would know better than me in this room. One of the foundational studies for Byzantine art is a book by Nikolai Kondakov. He's a Russian historian of the Tsarist period, end of the 19th century. The history of Byzantine painting primarily considered in miniatures. And there he talks, I encountered it in French, I don't read Russian, and there he talks about le beau modèle primitif, the beautiful primitive model. So it's a kind of primitivism, and this is in concert with evaluations of Byzantine art as a kind of primitivist artistic example during a time of the rise of the, let's say, the arts and crafts movement that values medievalism, etc. But not everybody agrees, because, as I said, there's this inferiority complex of orthodoxy keeping Russia behind in developments. After 1917 and into the Soviet period, a very big question, also the questions shift. A very big question after that is, my academic advisor Ihor Shevchenko wrote a paper, was there totalitarianism in Byzantium? And this is a question that he was asked to answer by, I'm blanking on his name now, Yeltsin. There was those, I don't know, who's a Byzantinist old enough in this room to have been at the Moscow conference in the early 90s? So it happened as the coup was unfolding, and Shevchenko was summoned. Anne McCabe and I share the same teacher, so she remembers, she knows. Shevchenko was summoned to answer this question of was there totalitarianism in Byzantium? I mean, why on earth would somebody who has urgent political problems to solve ask kind of the leading Byzantinist up present this question? I mean, very clearly there is a correlation with something in the present. I think also Byzantines who have been to conferences, let's say in Bulgaria, in Serbia, we are greeted there by government dignitaries. In France, in England, nobody pays that much attention to us because in former Eastern Europe, we are perceived as part of the national past, and we are not perceived as part of any national past in non-Orthodox countries. This is a kind of partial answer to what you said, but a whole book could be written on this.
Thank you very much.
How did the Byzantine Empire call itself?
Roman.
Yeah, but what was the title on the documents? What did they say? What was the...
Most of the time Roman, Ρωμαίοι, Αυτοκρατόρια των Ρωμαίων. I mean, for people of modern Greek descent, you know that we call ourselves Έλληνες, we call ourselves Romni. And what on earth Romni is, I could give you another lecture on.
No, but for instance, on the Germanic side, it's the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. So what did they call themselves?
On the signature.
Βασιλείς Ρωμαίων. That's how so,
Βασιλείς Ρωμαίων.
yes. So, but Βασιλεύς means emperor.
I know.
So Βασιλείς Ρωμαίων. So it's all Roman, and that's part of what the big deal is in the 19th century. Like, how can there be two Roman empires?
Yeah, go on.
And if you look at the neighbors, like the Arabs, for example, they apply the term Roman, Rum, only to the Byzantines. They don't apply it to the Westerners until after the Crusades. And they call the Crusaders Rum because they come from the same northern roots, and they do what the Byzantines were doing, which is fight with them. So there's a confusion of who is Roman and who is not. It has to do with geography and what they do. But to the Arabs earlier on, the only Romans are the Byzantines.
But Byzantine did not, I mean, the word was not.
No.
I was heartened by your injunction that historians and therefore other scientists should take the high ground and be bold and assert what they believe is correct and try to lead in a positive way. And this, to my mind, is similar to what art should be doing. And yet art is also fallen under the entertainment in various guises mantle. However, when art today takes the high ground, it is very publicly denounced as elitist. This denunciation may or may not have been addressed towards all other sciences, but given your injunction and hope, would you have something to comment on this problem of...
My only comment is I'm sticking by my guns, and from time to time I do pay a price. It's not very big so far. I mean, for example, when I speak up in faculty meetings, I don't try to make myself popular. That's, and I'm not. But some people like me for what I say, and sometimes they would come and tell me in private. They wouldn't say so in the faculty meeting. Some of my students come in private and tell me that they are relieved to hear me say something. I don't talk about, I don't do what I like. I don't talk about modern political situations, but it's very clear to them that I use past examples in order to comment on the medieval material. And then again, they're afraid to tell me in public, but they come in private and tell me. I'm not pretending to be a hero, as I said, but it's just that I think there is a fear of speaking freely. We are entering a new era of that, and I think it's a fear experienced by people on all ends of the political spectrum, and we really have to wonder what this means at a time when presumably we have the biggest freedom of speech ever, because anybody's free to do anything they like on the internet. And I think this is also closely related to problems that we still have to invent legal ways to deal with, like privacy. Another big problem that I try to give the tools to my students to address is figuring out what's fact and what's fiction from what you read on the internet. People my generation, let's say in Greece, you knew who owned which newspaper. You knew there were 2 TV channels, they were run by the government, and you were constantly aware that you need to be reading between the lines. And this was a kind of mental exercise that everybody was going through. Educated, not educated, young, old, everybody knew. What I see here is people trusting blindly some things that are obviously crazy and come from the internet, and there's no filter, and they don't know how to create filters. So that's what part of what I use the medieval material to show students, like it's kind of Quellen critique, criticism of sources, which is a 19th century exercise, applied, of course, to a very different environment.
Can you wait for the microphone?
Sorry.
No.
Thank you. Hi, I'm a product of the Chicago Public Schools, and because you brought up your children, I hope you don't mind me asking what your, and you also brought up history in the school curriculum. What is it like in California, if that's where your children have been educated the most?
I will give you, I could give you a lecture, but I will give you just one example from my...
Because I'll just say that when I was in high school in the 70s, you were required to have exactly 1 year of history, right? And you were also required to have a year of American history. So that's basically what most kids had, one year of history, which was American history.
Okay.
So... curious to know what's
okay, so
happening in
here's
California.
my experience in California, and here's what I found out by looking into the textbooks of Greek schools that are available now online. So I did this research a few days ago. This is from my son's experience in a private, academically highly regarded K through 8, like kindergarten through 8th grade, like end of middle school. They were not taught history as under the label of history, it was under the label of social studies. And there was, depending on the teacher at the time, so 1 year they had somebody who was an undergraduate major in history from UC Berkeley, and he was older, and he tried to cover from antiquity into the Middle Ages, into the modern period. He started with the European geography and expanded further in other directions. This was a recognizably older model. The year after that, they had another UC Berkeley undergraduate, like alumna. She was a Middle Eastern Studies major. And in the guise of history, they did kind of a history of religion, I'm not quite sure. So my son came to me and he said, we have to do something to do with religion, and I opted to do Islam because I know, Mom, you know a lot about Islam, and I want you to help me. So we went through the exercise of Islam. So my son came to know really well, to this day you can ask him which are the 5 pillars of the Muslim faith, and who Khadija was, and my husband's joke was, like, she was a widow who married the Prophet Muhammad. My husband said, the only widow that I know is Veuve Clicquot. You know, we had a family joke about all this. So jokes aside, he came to know a lot about Islam. Then it comes the time of the finals, and he says, Mom, we haven't covered everything very well, and the teacher said, we need to do some things by ourselves, so can you help me? I said, okay, let's read together. I see the rise of Christianity. I say, okay, who was Paul? He says, I don't know. I said, I didn't hear that very well. Who was Paul? He says, Mom, I don't know. Okay, I sit him down, I explain who Paul was. He was a Roman gentleman who was also Jewish. He's the person who decided to make Christianity, instead of a Jewish sect, into a world religion. Okay, the exam passes, etc. Fast forward a couple of summers later, we are at Philippi, which is one of the places where Paul preached Christianity, an iconic place. So we are there, there's other tourists there. I ask him, okay, so who was Paul? He says, Mom, I don't remember. Because anything I say, I'm an egghead. If it doesn't come from society at large, it doesn't matter. And then he sees some German tourists, and they come and and there's an English-speaking tour guide, so he eavesdrops. And then he hears that, this was a site where Paul preached, etc. After that, if I ask who Paul is, he now remembers. So this shows the power of education. I mean, I'm his mom, I'm crazy. He knows that I am, I teach other people, but it's impossible for anything to stick it if it comes from within the family. So this creates enormous gaps in education. And there's another thing that I've seen in California, which is there is an abandonment, because we as historians have abandoned historical narratives that have beginning, middle, and end chronologically. And we do things thematically, so we want to do topics. So now, middle schools and high schools want to do history thematically. What does this mean? They don't want to do antiquity to the Middle Ages to the modern period. They want to do globalization, slavery, colonialism. This necessarily privileges modern history and deprives history of any depth. It's as if everything was invented in the 19th century. At best, it was invented between the 16th and the 19th. People didn't exist before. This is a dehumanizing of history. Because depriving anyone of history is part of dehumanizing them. So we are blessing, in this way, a dehumanization of humanity at large. I'm not saying just Greek history. I stop here. We could have this discussion forever.
Shall we stop here?
Yes.
Okay. There is a question online that I will forward to you, and you will answer it.
Yes, I will.
Because I think this was a good point to sort of close. To thank you very much for all your insights and for being part of the Gennadios Library family. And please come down for a glass of wine, and we can
Thank
talk
you
more
all.
later.
I love you.